So welcome to today's presentation. Today's presentation, as we had told you before, we are talking about coping mechanism for real-time resilience, as you can see on your screen. And welcome to the conversation. I can see quite a number of people joining in as we speak. You're welcome to this coping mechanism for real-time resilience, and we are going to be taken through by Prina Patel. And our hope is that wherever you are, is that you're keeping safe and sound, since we met last week where we were having a conversation of positive parenting with Dr. Carol Chakua. And before even I introduce Ms. Prina Patel, I want to remind you of the question we're having, and the question is already on your chat. And what we are asking you is, as you can see on the chat, on the group chat, is what are your coping mechanism? Maybe even as we start the conversation already, you can tell us, you can share with us what are your coping mechanisms, because we are interested in hearing about your coping mechanisms. Tell us about your coping mechanisms, share with us, type in there, and we'll be reading them out in a few. As I've mentioned to you today, we are having a facilitation by Prina Patel, and she's talking about coping mechanism for real-time resilience, as you can see on your screen. And she holds a master's degree in applied positive psychology from Anglia Ruskin University in the United Kingdom. She divides her time between education projects in schools and other centers of learning in Kenya and in Rwanda. She has broad experience in a diverse range of industries, including banking, manufacturing, and education. She enjoys working with teachers and leadership teams on personal and leadership development using strength-based and positive organization scholarship principles. So that is Prina Patel for you. As you can hear, quite qualified and ready to give us, to take us through this conversation about coping mechanisms. So, as I mentioned to you, please go to the page, to the chat, and chat to tell us what are your coping mechanisms that you have been engaging in. So welcome, Prina Patel.
Thanks, Dominic.
Are you ready? Are you ready for this?
I think I am. Are you?
I am. I definitely think you are, and I can't wait to hear you. I can't wait to hear you. So take us through. Tell us more about your topic, and let's do this.
Okay, Dominic, what I'm going to start with is actually why resilience is so important in these times. And that kind of like begins with a definition of what resilience is and why it's so important. Now, if you look at most research converges on definitions of resilience that incorporate two elements. The first of those elements is the presence of significant adversities. And the second is positive adaptation in the face of these adversities. Now, what resilience is it's actually this ability that we have to steer through everyday adversities and challenge. How we adapt to major life changes, how we reach out, how we grow. And what happens is we're deemed to be resilient when we show patterns of positive adaptation, or when we recover in the context of any kind of like potentially destabilizing threats which touch our lives. So if we look at it, no matter who we are, where we live, COVID-19 has changed the way we live, the way we work, and the way we interact with each other. And moreover, this is something we haven't chosen. So how do we cultivate and draw on our resilience in the face of all these challenges? Some of the factors that have actually been considered crucial to cultivating resilience include acceptance, compassion, and gratitude. These are all things that we're going to be exploring shortly. So let's consider a little bit more about definitions. If we look at adversities are negative life circumstances. They're the daily stresses that exist in our lives. Stresses and other threats can vary in form, in size, and in intensity. They can range from daily small stresses like having to give a speech to a group of people, to kind of like life-altering events. So things like losing a loved one, suffering from a chronic illness, losing your job. Stresses can come from outside, so they can be external, or they can actually be created inside yourself. So if you look at something under the current circumstances, if you were to, for example, set yourself unrealistic expectations regarding productivity, especially during current conditions, that could be deemed stressful. Now, we all know that stress doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? It's a very, very normal part of life, and it serves a lot of useful purposes. It can motivate us to get that work promotion or pass that exam, to run the last mile of a marathon. But what happens is when stress accumulates or it's chronic, it can lead to serious repercussions with our health and our life. So this is what happens when it spirals out of control or when it becomes long term. When you consider positive adaptation, that's a little more complex to define, as it can incorporate two things. It can incorporate both externally behaviorally manifested criteria. This is stuff that we can observe. So you're looking at things like high productivity at work or at school, when you notice someone staying calm no matter what. But what positive adaptation can also look like is internal, and that is when you're like actually experiencing lower levels of distress and you have psychological well-being. So because we're all different, and we would all say that's like we adapt positively in different ways. My first question actually to all of you is like, what do you think positive adaptation looks like for you? So is it being able to be productive in the face of all this uncertainty? Is it just kind of like getting through that through the day? Is it kind of like taking some time out for you and like sharing like a laugh with your children? What does positive adaptation look like for you?
And it's
Sorry?
it's an interesting you asking that question, and at the same time the people have sent quite a number of comments, and maybe even as you continue, maybe I could read them out, a few of them,
Sure.
so that you could also respond to them. So I can see Richard saying, I love going for supervision, mostly counseling and social support from my close friends. There's Andrew asking whether this has to do anything related to COVID. Yeah, it is, because we are talking about this particular situation, but also you can go beyond it. Then there is Salome saying a lot of forgiveness, meditation, prayer, and focusing on the positives. There is Felicitas who is saying reading, jogging, having more time with my family, and listening to motivational mentors through online. And then Nancy, I read a lot of materials, pray and meditate early morning. And then Andrew is saying, I avoid watching negative publications, overthinking, focus on what I can do, talk to family and friends, enjoy learning new things. Mm-hmm. And of course, Prina is saying, hi, she is here and you're welcome. So you have said, you're talking about definition of resilience as, imposing, talking about adversity versus positive adaptation. And you asked the question, what does this look for you?
Yeah.
What do you think from the responses that are coming through?
I think some of those responses are great. So it's just like kind of like reaching out to people, continuing to try and learn and grow. Some of the things that have been referred to, such as like meditation, praying, those can actually also be coping mechanisms, which we're going to delve into a little later. So positive adaptation, you're looking at more kind of like an outcome related thing. So is it an internal outcome like staying calm, or like you're just like you feel mentally well, or is it like being productive or getting through the day? So when you talk about positive adaptation, it's more like, what does resilience look like to you as an outcome?
Great.
Okay.
So now, and this is now where you're shifting gears to telling us about the resources that one could have.
Yes. So basically, one of the key things to becoming more resilient is we become more resilient as we get better. Like when we look at three things: when we get better at managing our challenges, protecting our vulnerabilities, and building our resources. So the first thing I'm actually going to consider is building our resources. Now, if we look at it on the face of things, we have an inherent negative bias as human beings. This is something to do, it's like our like survival and evolution, but we're just kind of like hardwired to look on the negative side of things. This means that we frequently overestimate our challenges, and at the same time, we underestimate the resources that we have for dealing with these challenges. So identifying, using, and building our resources is a critical element in resilience. Now, these resources fall under 4 broad categories. Okay, the first one is psychological. This includes things like our strengths of character, our emotional intelligence. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So when we're looking at strengths of character, it includes things like self-awareness, self-compassion, kindness, determination. Some of these we're going to explore, but like there are, like, as you know, there are 24 strengths of character under the VIA survey. I don't have time to go through them all. There are, like I said, there are many tools available that can help us identify some of these psychological resources. And one I've already mentioned, and that's the VIA survey. So if you look at it, it's like the VIA character strength survey is something that if you haven't already taken it, you can use it to kind of like maybe like act as a bit of guidance to see like what your strengths of character are, which almost act as psychological resources. The other thing I mentioned was emotional intelligence. And this is kind of like being able to monitor our emotions, label them, and then kind of like use that emotional information to guide our thinking and our behavior. Our next set of resources is physical. So this includes things like our general health, our physical abilities. So are we physically fit? Can we walk? We're not sick. These are all actually physical resources. Our social resources are the connections and the relationships that we have in our lives. Okay, these are kind of like our friends, our family, and it's the support that they provide us. So social connections in terms of resources, they can offer you both tangible benefits. So you're looking at things like if you need monetary assistance, if you need a place to stay, cooking a meal for someone, running errands for people, but also it can be intangible benefits because like this is like the emotional support that you get from your network. And finally, we're considering environmental resources. This is the support that we get from where we live and where we work. So are we safe? Are we warm? Do we have everything that we need to work?
Yeah.
So what I want to consider next is actually some of the individual characteristics that have been found to correlate with resilience. Anne Maston is a professor at the University of Minnesota. She works in the Institute of Child Development. She's been involved in decades of research on the development of resilience, primarily in children, but a lot of these factors obviously carry over to adolescence and then adulthood and young adulthood. And some of the factors that have been found to contribute greatly to resilience from her research, I'm going to go through them one by one. The first is optimistic thinking. Now, if you look at her research and the research of several others, research corroborates that optimists are more likely to benefit from tough times. And why is this? Because they habitually look on the bright side of things. Okay, they're kind of like more inclined to see to actively search for that silver lining, but also they're more likely to ask for help. Now, this is not to say that pessimists can't benefit. But what happens is that you need to be a little more conscious about it. You need to take more conscious steps until it becomes a more natural part of your life. The second is like having a moral compass, so a deep belief system. And this comes primarily like down to your values. And why this is important is because when people face significant adversity, they often find that it changes their priorities and it changes their philosophies, both towards the present and also towards other people. You will often find when you're facing adversities or significant adversities that your deepest values come to light, because it's just like you really realize what you can and cannot live without. And it changes your perspective on what's important in your life. The third is like faith and spirituality practices. Now, these help by increasing social support, so you have that community, but also by directly fostering sense making. And why is sense making so important? Sense making is important because it's a retrospective consideration. So you're looking for plausible explanations and meanings for what is going on. And actually, it's like, again, as human beings, we do have this biologically inherent need to sense make. So it's like create a narrative around our lives and what's happening to us. Now, sense making is not venting, and this is actually something that I really wanted to emphasize. Venting or complaining to someone can yield benefits, but it's only short term. I mean, it's like it doesn't fix anything long term. So the relief is very short lived, and often it can make you feel worse. So sense making is a little more introspective, like you're looking back on things. I've already touched on this, but I'm going to touch on it again because it's so important. But relationships, so helping others, being a part of supportive social groups, having positive role models in your life. Social relationships are a key factor in predicting our health and our well-being, because why? It's like, as humans, we are an ultra social species. Okay, it's like it includes our need to belong, to care for and be cared for, and also like give and receive help. Like humor. So this idea of humor as a coping strategy or an antidote to stress dates back thousands of years. And what you frequently find from anecdotal evidence is that humor is a protective factor in resilience. When you kind of like try to approach this from a research perspective, it gets a little more complicated. This is because it is so multifaceted. Humor, if you think about it, includes elements of appreciation, of kind of like comprehending what's going around you, creativity when you're generating humor. And also, it's like what happens is like when either you are kind of like on the giving or receiving end of humor, it often causes like biological changes in arousal. Like, so it's like you feel yourself getting like more relaxed. So humor can lead to insight, it can lead to resolution. Laughing can reduce social tension, it can spur relaxation. And shared humor can also be formed, like it can be viewed as a form of play. It helps smooth interactions with other people, and it also boosts attachment. Now, from an early age, like literally from the time we were born, we experience and we show delight when we make things happen in the world around us, right? So when we master our environments, it's like consider, like look at a baby's face when they learn to crawl or when they learn to walk. This is what agency is. It's like agency is choice. It's that choice that you are making an active contribution to an outcome in the world around you. And agency is essential to resilience. It's that sense that you have that you're a cause rather than an effect, and you're an active participant in life. You're not like a passive recipient of what's going on around you. So you're taking initiative and rather than being swept along. And why is agency so important? Because without agency, you can't mobilize other internal resources for coping. Now, Dr. Maston refers to these factors and many others as ordinary magic, because these are mostly all ordinary processes and resources in human development, which most of us possess and most of us utilize.
If I can ask you a question there, Ms. Prina, on that previous slide.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe someone could have a question of humorous, humor.
Yes.
And maybe they say, well, I'm not a humorous person, if does it have to do with the character of the person when it comes to humor?
I mean, not necessarily. You don't have to be a humorous person. And it's like one of the key things to mention here, Dominic, is that we're all going to have elements of all these characteristics to different degrees and different variations. So even if we feel that we're not funny or humorous people, we can still benefit from humor when it's like when we're around funny people. When people make us laugh, they make us relax. And that's kind of like the characteristic that we're looking at when we say that it contributes to how we kind of like face resilience or build resilience.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for that.
No worries.
So you're going.
Yes.
No, I was just responding to those who might want to join in. I can see we have 79 participants, and if you have friends who want to join in, you can tell them that this is also on Facebook Live, on our Facebook page at Positive Psychology Association of Kenya. And you can keep contributing on what your coping mechanisms are, so that in addition to what Prina Patel has shared with us, so that also she can respond to them, but also maybe they can also, we can contribute to our body of knowledge. So thank you so much. So we are continuing this conversation, and do continue, Ms. Prina.
No worries. So what I'm actually going to delve into just a little bit more is how resilience and agency are connected. Because like, now remember, it's like resilience is, okay, it's how we choose to think, and it's how we choose to act. And that's going to determine the degree of our resilience. So when you're looking at these highly uncertain times, right, how can we experience agency? A lot of what's happening with COVID-19 can feel like it's out of our control. So just like governments are making decisions, they're like kind of like shutting down businesses, they're shutting down schools. So a lot of it feels like it's happening to us. And so many of its implications feel like they're outside of our control. So how do we experience agency in these uncertain times? Now, the first thing I would say is to look for and reflect on experiences where you're actually making a choice or influencing an outcome. With actions, just like this can include things like choosing to stay home and physically distance from those, from friends, from your loved ones, even if you see that others aren't doing this. It can mean choosing to help those who are struggling to make ends meet by whatever means you have available. It may also involve, it's like if you have to go out, you have to work. It's like choosing to like take as many like safety precautions as you can. It's like choosing how you spend your time, how to increase your mental well-being. Now it's like, I know it's like some of you are going to turn around and say it's like just like some people are really struggling and the options available are really, really limited. And I'm in no way disparaging this, but it's like when it feels like that is the case, it's really important to look for the little things you can do and focus on the feeling of agency regarding them. Now, when you consider resilience, remember that challenges, vulnerabilities, resources, okay, they exist in our mind, they exist in our body, and they exist in our world. And of these three domains, so to speak, the mind can often offer the greatest opportunity. Why? It's because it's where you have the most influence if you compare it to your body and your world. So if we can't exercise agency out there with deeds, with words, we can often make choices inside, in our minds. So the way we choose to think. So I now want to consider three approaches that we all need to start or actually carry on practicing, because I think a lot of us do unconsciously practice these. All of these three approaches greatly contribute to resilience, and they help us cope with the stresses in our lives. The first is acceptance. Okay, so recognizing and acknowledging that struggle is a natural part of life that we all go through greatly helps us accept what is going on around us and choosing where to focus our attention. So what can we change and what do we need to accept? This is actually a really, really important distinction to make. Ask yourself, which of your thoughts and which of your behaviors are helping you and which are harming you? Is the way you're thinking or behaving going to get you through this tough time? If not, what can you do? Now, the other thing with acceptance is, I just want to really, really briefly touch on this, is emotions. It's just like, sometimes it's like if we're feeling sad or upset, this is fine. And it's okay to like recognize this, acknowledge that it's okay to feel this way. But try to kind of like also find a way to move past it. Let's consider compassion. Now, when I talk about compassion, I'm not talking about compassion only for others, but also for ourselves. It's important to recognize here that we're all facing different kinds and different intensities of struggles. Some of us are working from home. Some of us are working from home and dealing with homeschooling. Others are struggling with making daily ends meet economically. So everyone has a different set of issues that they're working through. So benchmarking ourselves against others, especially when you see what people are doing on social media, it can result in us setting unexpected expectations for ourselves, and this results in a rapid descent and becoming overwhelmed. Now, the reality here is like, look, most of us have never been busier, right? We may be struggling to meet that high productivity bar that we're setting for ourselves. Like I should be able to achieve as much at home as I can when I'm in the office. That may not be the case. So what we need to do here is approach things with compassion. And this is both towards ourselves and towards others. So lower the bar and do the best that you can under the circumstances that you're facing. And finally, the third process that I want to talk about is actually gratitude. Now, gratitude for me, it's never more important than in tough times. And this is because it keeps us present. And it helps put things into perspective. It will improve our relationships with those around us. Now, even in these times when it feels like we're all in this tunnel and there's uncertainty and we don't know when we're going to come out of it, good things are happening. And even if it's a really, really tough day, you need to hunt for that good stuff, trust me, it is out there. So it's important to consciously focus on what is still good in our lives to avoid getting overwhelmed with all that uncertainty. Dominic, how are we doing with responses on the chat? Are we good?
Quite a flood actually, and I also asked if you have a question you could also respond to. So let me read out some of the comments that have come through. We have one from Mary. I cope through relating with others. Richard, coping mechanisms, definitely hanging around positive-minded people. That is from Richard. Mm-hmm. Then Mona Lisa says, remember, Richard, I think that's a conversation between the two. Then Martha is saying, choosing to learn and relearn some things. Mm-hmm. Trusting God and just surrender and wait upon Him. That is Opio. Then we've got Mosetti saying, I cope through talking to someone, friends, family members, mostly by phone calls, I guess. Jacqueline, focus on what is within my control. Agency, powerful. And then Carol says, so glad to know that lowering the bar is an option. Absolutely, it's an option. For sure. Thank you for that.
100%. It's like do what you can. It's like I think I can't stress that enough.
Yeah. Your talk is really hitting some very important buttons. Yeah. Then there is previous slide. Please, you kindly go back to the previous slide so people can maybe see it a bit. There it is. Sometimes I use defense mechanism. Okay. Sometimes you use defense. Sometimes you use coping. Maybe you can mention something on that.
I think if we carry on, we're actually addressing some of this in the next part. Get to perfect. Kind of like early warning signs, different kinds of coping mechanisms, and what we can do.
Yeah. Perfect. So just a few more comments, and then I give it back to you. Most of things we tend to learn from them. I guess you mean coping mechanism. We have the ability to accept changes when they come in our lives. Thank you. Coping, spending time with family and friends. Mosetti, there's a question for you, Prina. How can you help someone when annoyed by the parents you don't have the desire to speak to them and can't stay a week without talking to them? Okay, that's quite a complex question. I hope you could respond to that at some point.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, it's like these are some great questions actually.
Yeah, and the second question then you can respond maybe to both is silence a positive coping mechanism? That is from Amani.
Okay. I think maybe both the answer to both will kind of like emerge over the next few slides.
Perfect.
So if it's okay for me to take that cop-out mechanism, and if they still feel the question hasn't been answered towards the end, then we can revisit it then.
All right.
Is that
That's
okay?
quite okay. Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay. Now, I mentioned kind of like being overwhelmed earlier, and it's just like kind of like when you're just like, so things like the comment that we had, that it's nice to know that lowering the bar is an option. It absolutely is option. It's like, because when like stress becomes chronic and becomes long term, it's very easy to get overwhelmed, right? And when you get overwhelmed, your physical and your mental capabilities for adaptation, they become overloaded, so you can't adapt. Now if this happens, you can't be resilient. Now let's consider some of the things that lead to us being overwhelmed, and I think this list will resonate with a lot of people. I'm going to go through some of them, but you can read through the rest at your leisure. So things like not enough sleep. Okay, when you're tired, you lack energy, everything you do or try to do seems harder. So like that can be a contributing factor to becoming overwhelmed. When you spend time worrying about things you can't control, and also just like worrying about like just like trying to control everything. So a large part of resilience kind of like comes from accepting that you can't control everything. Then things like too much news, too much social media, this can kind of like contribute to you becoming overwhelmed by like, because there's too much screen time, and two, there's also information overload. You can get overwhelmed when you set unrealistic expectations, or when you expect to do everything perfectly. Poor time management can contribute to becoming overwhelmed. Now, this can be at two ends of the spectrum. It's often like a bit of a continuum. So you need to strike that balance. If your time management is lax, you might find yourself getting bored and distracted, getting nothing done, and then kind of like the stress of getting nothing done leads to you being overwhelmed. But the other side of it is overscheduling. So putting too much in your diary, like committing to complete like too much every day, that can lead to burnout, and that can lead to becoming overwhelmed. Things like not having enough downtime. We can't always be on. It's just like it's not physically and mentally possible for work, for family, for others. It drains and it exhausts us, and we become overwhelmed. So when we're close to being overwhelmed, we often exhibit certain symptoms, right? We all feel, we react differently because we're all different people. But if you look at it, some of the general early warning signs that you're close to becoming overwhelmed and you need to take action to kind of like step back from that precipice are things like a loss of perspective. So you just like kind of like lose that ability to consider different sides of a situation, to see what's going on. You may lose your sense of humor. So you like may just say, okay, this is just not funny anymore. You result in like black and white thinking. So it's like either wrong or right, or yes or no. You find yourself becoming irritable or withdrawn, and you may even like experience confusion and like be more prone to emotional outbursts. Now, with early warning signs, it's really important to build your self-awareness on what your early warning signs are. And knowing and understanding what your early warning signs are, that you're close to being overwhelmed, can help you kind of like take action before you actually get there. Now, for me, I know that I tend to get irritable. I lose flexibility in thinking. But what I was also told once by someone that I trusted a lot was that I tend to withdraw. Now, this is important because you may already have some idea of what your early warning signs are, but you can always improve your own self-awareness. And this can be done through various means. So by looking outward at some of like your reactions and your behaviors under certain circumstances, also asking trusted others, so your friends, your partner, your children, how they see that like you act or react before you have that outburst, before you have that meltdown. Introspection can help, but its usefulness is very limited. Okay, this is because most of our thought processes, if you think about it, are unconscious. So therefore, most of our behaviors and most of our habits may be as well. In fact, I think there's research out there that says habits form almost 40% of our daily processes, our daily actions. So asking your partner or close friends what they see as your early warning signs can greatly contribute to your own self-awareness. Now, if you get to that overwhelmed stage, really the only thing you can do is calm down. This can be things like deep breathing exercises, you can go for a walk. And this is so that you're creating some space between yourself and what's happened to you. And you're giving yourself a chance to respond rather than react. Okay. One of the simplest antidotes to stress is belly breathing. So deep belly breathing. Deep belly breathing is super effective because it evokes the body's natural relaxation response. It helps relieve muscle tension all over your body. It helps lower your heart rate and your blood pressure. An added benefit is when you focus your thoughts on your breathing or even on counting the breaths, it helps settle your mind and it helps calm you down. So another question for you guys is, how do you calm yourself down, right? And I would stress here that it's really important when you think about methods that you use to calm yourself down to have a mix of like really quick 30-second practices, maybe some 5-minute ones, and longer lasting activities. We're not always going to have like 15, 20, 30 minutes to calm ourselves down. Sometimes it's the space of a few breaths. It doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be graceful or fashionable. It just needs to work for you. Let's look at Monica. From those of you who watch Friends, she loves to clean, right? And cleaning can actually, it's something that like you might be able to do to like calm yourself down. So have Dominic, have any people responded as to kind of like their calming down mechanisms?
Well, there are some interesting insights on what how people get irritated or how they feel when they get overwhelmed.
Yeah.
I'm seeing. Okay, just to read a few more comments so that I acknowledge those who have written. So this one was saying, I actually feel overwhelmed with the daily assignments. Stephen is saying so. Mololo is saying, I think humor has really helped us as a people, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. I remember some memes gave me a chuckle during heavy moments. So that's a good way of humor, as you spoke about so well. Then COVID has given time to pray. At the beginning, this is Atimango. At the beginning, I found I was spending more time shaking the website for checking, I get. For updates of coronavirus, I realized I was becoming scared and depressed. Now I have learned to act differently. Perfect. For me, actually, when I am feeling overwhelmed, I start stammering. Interesting. And repeating words when with a client. That is from Richard. Mary says, I get irritated and speak very fast. Yeah. Then Anne says, when I was told to work from home, I went into denial unconsciously. Caro said, my mind locks when I am overwhelmed, just freezes. Cyprian, confused when I can't tell my feelings. Interesting. Jem says, when you are overwhelmed and you have withdrawal, it's a better way of trying to calm down. That's what you said. That is his thought. Richard asks, what about drinking soda like Fanta, something with sugar? Maybe you could respond to that also, although I can also see that
I think sugar rush can help. It can be a quick maybe calming down approach. So like sometimes I was like, I'm going to cover this a little bit later in self-control, so I don't want to say too much. But for example, just like when I want a quick fix, or when it's like kind of like, okay, I'm like when I start to get to that stage where I'm feeling overwhelmed and I'm irritable, it's just like a little piece of like dark chocolate, or like you're just like it's something that works for you. So I am in no way or position to kind of like judge that. So if soda works for Richard, soda works for Richard.
Father Selvam is of the opinion that sugar can cause us a mood, swing.
It can.
Can
I
cause
think if you
mood.
overdo it.
Yeah. So there are many comments. So there are those who are saying they listen to music. Pardon me if I don't mention your name, so that I can read as many comments as possible, and so that I can give Prina time to go on. There are very many comments coming in, and I am grateful that you are sending them in. Asante sana. There are those who say they clean and arrange things, calming themselves with music, nature walk, daily exercise, long drives, watching favorite episodes.
Mm-hmm.
There's those who are saying sometimes it's difficult to do some of these exercises if you're at work, but taking long breaths can work. Crying.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
There are those who say they sleep. Then there is self-talk, watching movies. So has been mentioning. So self-talk. There is sewing and writing. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of breathing
Okay.
exercise
So
that
I
are
think,
mentioning. Yeah.
Dominic, what I'll do is I'll go on, because a lot of these, a lot of what you've been reading, actually, so things that calm yourself down can also kind of overlap with what your coping mechanisms are. So how you kind of revive and rejuvenate, which we're going to cover in a bit.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So it actually segues quite nicely into what our next part is, which is resilience is a function of how you manage your challenges, right? So how do you cope with these stresses? And before we kind of go into the mechanisms, just what is coping? So coping is how we manage specific external and or internal demands. This is in situations that we feel are taxing or that exceed the resources that we possess. So let's consider some of the basics. Coping mechanisms tend to fall into three categories. They can either be problem focused or emotion focused. So problem focused is often when you're identifying that stressor and taking an active approach to engaging with it. Emotion focused coping, if you wanted a really quick summary, it centers mainly around making yourself feel better. So you're focusing on dealing with the emotions surrounding the situation rather than the situation itself. Coping mechanisms can either be approach or avoidance oriented. Now, approach oriented mechanisms are things like yours, like acceptance, problem solving. It's behavior that is oriented in the direction of the threat or the stressor. Avoidance is when our behavior is oriented away from the stressor. So this is things like denial, mental disengagement, and distraction. Coping mechanisms can either be adaptive or they can be maladaptive. Now, adaptive coping mechanisms are those which contribute towards some sort of resolution. This can be things like confronting problems directly, trying to prevent negative effects on the body. So things like meditation, exercise. Maladaptive coping mechanisms are those that could result in further problems down the line. This could be things like withdrawing from your support network. It could be substance abuse. So if you start to drink too much, for example. The important takeaway that I would stress from this slide is that there is no wrong or right way to cope. There is no one method that is superior. It will all come down to the situation you're facing, your resources, what you're basically capable of at the time. So let's consider a little bit more about problem.
If I may take you back to that previous slide, could you maybe explain again what is the difference between the problem focused and approach oriented?
There isn't, but it's so if you look at it, problem focused is often approach oriented behavior, but emotion focused can be either approach or avoidance oriented. So if for example, an approach oriented emotion focused coping mechanism could kind of be accepting what's going on and then focusing on what's what we can do to cope with the situation at hand. Whereas if we were kind of like overwhelmed and we just kind of like mentally disengaged, we shut down, that's avoidance oriented. So it's like behavior that's actually oriented away from the stress.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. So let's consider some examples of problem focused coping behaviors. This can include things like seeking information. Remember, it's like knowledge can reassure us, but the thing that I would stress with seeking information is kind of like moderation and also choosing your sources carefully. Managing your time, so keeping helpful daily routines or making new ones to kind of like adjust to the new situation you find yourself in. This could be sticking to a routine like you're actually going to work or school, having an end of day ritual so that you kind of like work towards something. So in short, just like manage your time as productively as you can. It can be problem solving. So taking steps towards resolving problems where you're able to. So what is within your control? You're just like, if your child is facing a homework problem or not understanding something, maybe that's something you can help with. That's problem focused problem solving approach. You could ask others for help or advice when you need it. This comes down to kind of like your relationships, your social support network. You could learn new skills. This was something I think that was actually mentioned in one of their comments. Change the situation. So for example, if we're stuck at home and we're all in each other's face, you're trying to work in the dining room, but there's too many distractions, kind of like try and take yourself to maybe like the bedroom or a quieter room and find a quieter space. Change your situation. The other thing is like improving your self-control. So think about the healthy and the useful habits that can help you improve your well-being. What can you use this time? It's like, can you take like 30 seconds? Can you take 5 minutes to meditate in the morning, for example? How can you kind of like improve your self-control? Improving self-control may also kind of like be like every time you're on a break, like not walking towards the fridge, but instead like walking up and down the stairs, for example. The other problem focused coping strategy that I would talk about is actually assertive communication. Now, assertive communication here doesn't mean aggressive, right? It just means kind of like firmly and honestly, openly communicating with maybe family, with work, regarding kind of like expectations, like your behaviors, their behaviors, how you can all like live together and work together better in these times. Now, I mentioned before that in a situation like the current one with COVID, it often feels like a lot of stuff is happening to us and we can only like take measures to make ourselves feel better. So not all active problem focused coping strategies will be relevant, and you need to kind of experiment and pick and choose what works for you. So how do you know what to prioritize when you're close to feeling overwhelmed? As previously mentioned, emotion-focused coping strategies center mainly around making yourself feel better. These strategies can include things like exercise. Now, for me, this is like, it's crucial. I can't begin to tell you guys how irritated and overwhelmed I can get if I've gone a couple of days without moving. So things like scheduling at least 30 minutes of movement, if you can. This can be a family thing, it can be an individual thing, see what works for you. Self-care. So some of you have already put this in like the comments. We're going to talk about it a little bit more in the next couple of slides. Things like, just like, what do you do? Like, what are your self-care rituals? Is it like taking a bath? Is it sleeping? What makes you feel better? Social coping is things like, it's like, remember, strong relationships are equated with strong well-being. So it's important to keep reaching out to others, keep talking, keep texting, keep calling. It's like socially, physically distant walks if you can manage it. Positive reappraisal is one that I won't actually have enough time to go through, but it's like kind of like, if you were to sum it up, it's like, how can you look on the bright side of things, right? It's just like, how can, like, what is the good in the situation that you're facing? Someone's already mentioned it. I can mention it again. Meditation. So this can also include like mindfulness activities, which if you're interested in, you should definitely tune in for Dr. Churu's webinar next week. It can include things like, it's like meditating. Like I said, it's like sometimes at the end of a hard day of work, like you might need that drink to like calm yourself down. You may be suffering from a condition and you need like sleeping pills to help you sleep. Approach these things with moderation and possibly where needed, like with guidance. We touched on this as a process, but accepting. So accepting that struggle is a natural and a real part of life, and focusing on things that we can control. And most obviously, it's like kind of like recreation. So what do you do? Like, say, you know, get creative, listen to music, go out for a walk if you can. You're just like, what makes you happy? Like art, drawing, writing, painting, reading, anything. So there's a mix.
Prina seems to have gone off a bit. Prina?
Can you hear me now?
Prina, you had your voice. Yes,
okay.
You had hung a bit, so maybe you could repeat a few of the sentences you said. Yeah.
Where did you lose me? Did you lose me at acceptance or at recreation?
Yeah, just after acceptance.
Okay, so acceptance was something we went through in an earlier slide.
Acceptance, after acceptance.
If you accept that struggle is a natural and a very kind of like, it's something that happens to all of us, and kind of like focusing your attention on the things you can control. And recreation, so what makes you happy is like, is it getting creative? Someone mentioned sewing. For me, it's reading or listening to music. It might be doing a puzzle with a family. So what do you do in terms of recreation? Now, I mentioned self-care as an emotion-focused coping strategy, and also recreation, right? Self-care to me is essential because remember, we can't pour from an empty cup, okay? If we're not calm and centered in ourselves, we will not be effective in responding to the needs of those around us. Now, as with things that calm you down, it's important to have a mix of activities in your coping toolkit, right? You want the quick wins. So you want things like breathing exercises, taking a quick walk around the block, listening to a couple of songs. If you journal, and I think, Dominic, this might be something you touch on in your presentation, like the 3 good things exercise. You might want to take a shower or a bath or sleep. So these were both things that actually people have already shared in the chat. Now, you will also have other activities that require more planning and time, right? So things like getting creative, like so spending a couple of hours or an afternoon painting or writing, playing some music. It may involve exercise. It may involve playing a board game with your family. Making a vision board is a fun and like kind of like a very forward thinking thing to do. You can clean out your closet. So I think someone mentioned cleaning. Doing something nice for someone else. So compassion, kindness. These are like often really, really good ways to rejuvenate and to ground us. So
I would suggest though on the previous slide that that taking shower should be a daily exercise.
It should, but it's also maybe taking more than one shower. Although with the current water shortage in Nairobi, I maybe wouldn't recommend that. But yeah. You know, it's like for me, I think it's like taking a shower, for example. It's like it just refreshes you, it revives you. So like that's why it's a quick win and a daily habit you should incorporate.
Sure. All right.
As with things that calm you down, what coping mechanisms are in your toolkit, right? So like I said, it's like they don't have to be big, they don't have to be graceful, pretty. What works for you? And this was the question that you had put out in the chat. I'm sure you'll send, you will share some of those responses. I'm just going to finish up and then maybe we can start that in the Q&A. And the slide that I actually want to share with you last is like one of my favorite diagrams, okay? This is what I look at when I'm close to being overwhelmed. It's a reminder to myself on what to prioritize. So what matters to me and what can I control? Mental agility, which is at the heart of resilience, is being able to focus our attention on that area, that shaded green area that falls at the cross section, that lies between the things that matter to us and the things that we can control. So where can we exercise agency? And as much as possible, we need to let go of the other stuff. Now, the last thing, so I'm just going to do a very, very quick review of what we can do to increase resilience. Like this applies very, very significantly to what we're going through now, but even it will be useful as the world emerges from the effects of COVID. So identify and recognize your early warning signs. What are the signs that you're close to becoming overwhelmed, and take action to like step back from that precipice. Revive and rejuvenate. Now experiment and find those coping mechanisms that work for you. Remember to have that mix of 30-second, 5-minute, and longer exercises. Stay present. Okay, it's like avoid forecasting too far ahead, because with all the ongoing uncertainty, it very, very quickly gets overwhelming. Approach things with compassion. Lower that bar, okay, both towards yourself and for others, and just do the best you can. And remember that at the heart of resilience lies mental agility. Okay, it's your agency, focusing that attention at that intersection between what matters to you and what you can control. And ending on a quite a, I hope, positive note, remember that tough times don't last, tough people do.
Yeah.
And with that, Dominic, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
First of all, very good.